Hey everybody, welcome back. We are in chapter 15, section 2, starting on page 452, titled A Nation Dividing. American Diary. On May 24th, 1854, the people of Boston erupted in outrage. Federal officers had seized Anthony Burns, a runaway enslaved African American who lived in Boston, to return him to slavery. Abolitionists tried to rescue Burns from the federal courthouse, and city leaders attempted to buy his freedom. All efforts failed. Federal troops escorted Burns to a ship that would carry him back to Virginia and into slavery. In a gesture of bitter protest, Bostonians draped buildings in black and hung the American flag upside down. The Fugitive Slave Act. Main idea. The Fugitive Slave Act required all citizens to help catch runaways, yet many Northerners refused to cooperate. History in you. Have you ever tried to protect someone from a bully? Read how Northerners tried to thwart the efforts of slave hunters. As part of the Compromise of 1850, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky convinced Congress to pass the Fugitive Slave Act as an attempt to pacify slaveholders. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required all citizens to help catch runaways. Anyone who aided a fugitive could be fined or imprisoned. People in the South believed the law would force Northerners to recognize the rights of Southerners. Instead, enforcement of the law convinced more people in the North of the evils of slavery. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, slaveholders stepped up their efforts to catch runaway enslaved people. They even tried to capture runaways who had lived in freedom in the North for years. Sometimes they seized African Americans who were not trying to escape and forced them into slavery. In spite of the penalties, some Northerners refused to cooperate with the law. They justified their opposition on moral grounds. In his 1849 essay, Civil Disobedience, Henry David Thoreau wrote that if the law, quote, requires you to be the agent or cause of injustice to another, then I say break the law, close quote. The Underground Railroad, a network or interconnected system of free African Americans and whites, helped runaways make their way to freedom. Anti-slavery groups tried to rescue African Americans who were being pursued or to free those who were captured. In Boston, members of one such group followed federal agents shouting, slave hunters, there go to the slave hunters. People contributed funds to buy the freedom of African Americans. Northern juries refused to convict those accused of violating the Fugitive Slave Act. Reading check. Explaining. What was the purpose of the Underground Railroad? Page 454, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Main idea. The Kansas-Nebraska Act resulted from another dispute over slavery in Congress. History in you. Do you recall how the Missouri Compromise limited slavery in the territories? Read how this agreement fell apart in the 1850s. Franklin Pierce, a New Hampshire Democrat, became president in 1853. Pierce intended to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1854, Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator who forged the Compromise of 1850, introduced a bill in Congress. He proposed organizing the region west of Missouri and Iowa as the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas hoped his plan to expand the nation would be acceptable to both the North and the South. Because of the location, Kansas and Nebraska seemed likely to become free states. Both lay north of the 36° 30' north latitude, the line set in the Missouri Compromise as the limit of slavery. Douglas knew Southerners would object to admitting Kansas and Nebraska as free states because it would give free states more votes in the Senate. As a result, Douglas proposed abandoning the Missouri Compromise and letting the settlers in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. He called this popular sovereignty, allowing the people to decide. Passage of the Act. Many Northerners protested. Douglas's plan to repeal the Missouri Compromise would allow slavery into areas that had been free for more than 30 years. Southerners in Congress, however, supported the bill. They expected Kansas to be settled mostly by slaveholders from Missouri who would vote to keep slavery legal. With some support from Northern Democrats and the backing of President Pierce, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Excuse me. Conflict in Kansas. Right after the law passed, pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed into Kansas. When elections took place, a pro-slavery legislature was elected. Although only about 1,500 voters lived in Kansas at the time, more than 6,000 people cast ballots. Thousands of pro-slavery supporters from Missouri crossed the border just to vote in the election. These Missourians traveled in armed groups and became known as border ruffians. Soon the new Kansas legislature passed laws supporting slavery. One law even restricted political office to pro-slavery candidates. The anti-slavery people refused to accept these laws. Instead, they armed themselves, held their own elections, and adopted a constitution that banned slavery. By January 1856, rival governments existed in Kansas, one for and one against slavery. Bleeding Kansas. With both sides arming themselves, an outbreak of violence became inevitable, or unavoidable. In May 1856, 800 slavery supporters attacked the town of Lawrence, a stronghold of anti-slavery settlers. The attackers burned the Free State Hotel and destroyed 2 newspaper offices and many homes. Soon after, anti-slavery forces retaliated. John Brown, a fervent abolitionist, believed God chose him to end slavery. The attack on Lawrence enraged Brown. He vowed to strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people. One night, Brown led a group along the Pottawatomie Creek, where they seized and killed 5 supporters of slavery. Armed bands soon roamed the territory. Newspapers referred to Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War in Kansas. A civil war is a conflict between citizens of the same country. In October 1856, the territorial governor sent federal troops to stop the bloodshed. Violence also broke out in Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts lashed out against pro-slavery forces in Kansas. He also criticized pro-slavery senators such as Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber and hit Sumner with a cane. Sumner fell to the floor, unconscious and bleeding. This incident and the Kansas feud revealed the rising hostility between North and South. Reading check. Explaining. What events led to Bleeding Kansas? Section 2 review. Number 1, vocabulary. Define the following. Network. Popular sovereignty. Border ruffians. Inevitable. Civil War. Main ideas. 2, listing. What were some ways that Northerners defied the Fugitive Slave Act? 3, explaining. How would the issue of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska be decided under the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Okay, that wraps it up for Chapter 15, Section 2.